December 7, 1941, would forever be remembered as the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor. But the secret war that made such events possible, and then ultimately determined their outcomes, had begun long before the bombs fell. In hidden rooms in Washington, D.C., in basements near Pearl Harbor, and in converted offices in Manila, men and women worked silently against time, against mathematics, and against a determined opponent who believed their secrets could never be broken. This was the hidden war of the Codebreakers, a campaign of the mind and the machine fought far from the sound of gunfire, but decisive to the fate of the Pacific. When the Japanese Foreign Ministry introduced its new cipher machine in the late 1930s, they considered it unbreakable. It was an electromechanical marvel called the Type B cipher machine, later codenamed Purple by the Americans. Built on a system of stepping switches, it was designed to generate almost infinite variations of scrambled text, each more confusing than the last. Unlike earlier codes, which could sometimes be unraveled by linguists spotting repeated phrases, Purple appeared completely random. To Japanese diplomats, it was security incarnate, the guarantee that Tokyo's instructions could cross oceans untouched. To the American cryptanalysts watching from across the Pacific, it was a challenge that could not be ignored. The task of solving Purple fell largely to a small team in Washington. There, in a cramped office inside the old munitions building, sat the Navy's cryptanalytics section, known as OP-20G. The men who worked there were not frontline sailors or traditional warriors. They were mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers, men like Frank Rowlett, who had a gift for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. Beside him worked women drawn from colleges, chosen for their aptitude with languages and numbers. These women, often underestimated by the world outside, became the backbone of the effort. They typed thousands of intercepted groups, sorted endless cards, and kept the machinery of code-breaking alive when fatigue and monotony threatened to overwhelm the effort. What made Purple different was that the Americans did not have the machine itself. They had only the encrypted messages intercepted daily by radio operators stationed from Guam to California. Each day delivered streams of seemingly meaningless letters, broadcasts filled with static and distortion that had to be logged, transcribed, and passed along to the analysts. To reconstruct the system, Rowlett and his colleagues had to imagine what kind of machine could produce such garbled patterns. It was like trying to sketch the shape of an animal by studying its tracks in the mud. Day after day, week after week, they wrote, calculated, guessed, and discarded, until at last, in 1940, they built a working analog of the Purple machine entirely from scratch. With it, they could read Japanese diplomatic traffic almost as fast as Tokyo could send it. This breakthrough gave Washington a priceless window into Japanese intentions, even before Pearl Harbor. But diplomacy was only part of the picture. The greater challenge was the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational code, codenamed JN-25. Where Purple was a machine, JN-25 was a system built on massive printed codebooks. Each word, phrase, or syllable corresponded to a 5-digit number, which was then disguised further by the addition of random numbers called additives. The effect was devastating for codebreakers. Without the codebooks, the numbers appeared as endless sequences with no meaning. And when the Japanese changed their codebooks, all previous work was rendered obsolete. For the Americans, breaking JN-25 required both mathematics and patience on a scale they had never attempted before. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by the eccentric commander Joseph Rochefort, became the spearhead of this effort. Rochefort was an unlikely leader, a man known for his casual dress, his dry humor, and his tendency to work in slippers rather than polished shoes. Yet beneath the relaxed exterior was one of the sharpest analytic minds of the war. He gathered around him a team of officers and civilians who thrived in an environment of relentless problem-solving. Their offices were cluttered with chalkboards covered in numbers, index cards pinned to walls, and ashtrays overflowing from endless hours of smoking. The sound of typewriters and adding machines filled the air as linguists tried to reconstruct fragments of the codebook from intercepted messages. The work was crushingly monotonous. Analysts spent days looking at columns of digits, searching for repeats that might indicate common words like fleet, aircraft, or Tokyo. When even a small sequence matched across several messages, it was a breakthrough worth celebrating. Slowly, through these fragments, they began to reconstruct the vocabulary of the Japanese Navy. Progress was measured not in hours or even weeks, but in months. And just when a codebook was finally yielding results, the Japanese would issue a new one, forcing the entire process to begin again. Yet each rebuild went faster than the last, and each time Hypo and OP-20G grew more confident in their ability to pierce the enemy's secrets. One of the great ironies of this hidden war was that the Japanese themselves made mistakes that accelerated their defeat. Human beings cannot help but fall into habits, and radio operators in Tokyo often repeated additives or used predictable phrases at the beginning of messages. Formal Japanese language itself, with its ritualistic expressions, provided the Americans with footholds. Phrases like "I respectfully inform" or "I acknowledge receipt" appeared with enough regularity that analysts could guess their structure and then peel away layers of the code. What had once seemed impenetrable gradually became vulnerable, not because the machine or the mathematics failed, but because people are creatures of routine. As America edged closer to war in the Pacific, the tension inside these secret stations grew. Rochefort's team at Hypo worked 16-hour days, fueled by bad coffee and determination. They slept on cots in the office, their uniforms rumpled, their eyes bloodshot. Washington demanded results, but they had only fragments, pieces of a vast puzzle still incomplete. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, the devastation overshadowed the reality that American codebreakers had already laid the foundations for victories yet to come. They had not been able to predict the exact location of the assault, but their progress against Japanese codes would soon transform the course of the war. Purple had shown them the possibilities. Reading diplomatic traffic revealed tensions between Tokyo and Berlin, negotiations with Moscow, and the attitudes of Japanese diplomats scattered across Europe and Asia. It was a window into the strategic mind of Japan, even if it did not provide direct operational orders. But it was JN-25 that mattered most for the battlefield, and here the codebreakers refused to give up. They knew that within those streams of numbers lay the plans of fleets, the schedules of convoys, the assignments of carriers and submarines. If they could read them, they could fight not blind, but with foresight. What made this war truly hidden was the secrecy surrounding it. Very few commanders outside of naval intelligence knew the full extent of the work. Even senior admirals received only the results, never the details of how they were obtained. To protect the advantage, codebreakers invented elaborate cover stories. When an American submarine ambushed a Japanese convoy, it was explained as luck or reconnaissance. When carriers appeared at the right place at the right time, commanders credited bold decision-making. The truth that American analysts had read the enemy's intentions in advance remained locked in classified reports, known only to a handful of men at the top. Yet the stress of this secret war was immense. Every day, the analysts feared the Japanese would discover the breach and change their methods completely. If Tokyo shifted to a new system beyond the Americans' reach, the fragile advantage would vanish overnight. The codebreakers lived with this constant anxiety, knowing that their work meant life or death for sailors in the Pacific. Mistakes were not measured in lost opportunities, but in sunken ships and dead men. Behind the numbers were the people. Rochefort himself became a legend, though he rarely sought attention. His team respected him for his ability to see connections no one else could. Beside him were men like Edwin Layton, the fleet intelligence officer, who translated cryptanalytic results into operational warnings. And there were the women, hundreds of them, who joined the Navy's WAVES program and worked tirelessly at typewriters and tabulators. Many never knew the impact of their labor, sworn to secrecy long after the war, but without their meticulous effort, the entire system would have collapsed. They were the unseen hands of victory. The battle against Purple and JN-25 was more than an intellectual contest. It was a race against time. Every intercepted message grew less valuable with each hour that passed. A convoy location was useful today but meaningless tomorrow. A fleet movement predicted in advance could be countered. Learned afterward, it was just history. The codebreakers lived under this pressure constantly, knowing that their window to act was always closing. Speed mattered as much as accuracy, and the balance between the two was never easy. In retrospect, it is clear that this hidden war laid the groundwork for one of the greatest turning points of the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. By May 1942, Rochefort's team had pieced together enough of JN-25 to suspect a major operation aimed at an objective codenamed AF. Through clever deception, they confirmed AF meant Midway, and Admiral Nimitz was able to position his carriers for an ambush. The result was a decisive American victory, one that crippled the Japanese carrier fleet. But the seeds of that victory had been sown long before in the tedious, relentless work of decoding streams of numbers in dimly lit rooms. The hidden war of the codebreakers never appeared in headlines. The sailors on deck, the Marines on islands, the pilots in cockpits never saw the men and women behind the intercepted signals. Yet their influence stretched across every battle, every convoy, every decision made in the Pacific theater. They turned mathematics into strategy, patience into power, and silence into victory. Japan's confidence in its unbreakable codes was shattered not by force of arms, but by persistence of mind. And in the end, it was this unseen war, fought with pencils, paper, and primitive machines, that gave the United States the vision it needed to win in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific had already transformed into a contest of endurance and deception. The Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across Southeast Asia, seized resource-rich territories, and fortified island after island. Their early victories created the illusion of unstoppable momentum, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Those cracks were invisible on the battlefield. They were hidden in radio signals, in numbers broadcast across the airwaves, and in the arrogance of commanders who believed their codes were still secure. It was through these signals that American codebreakers began to glimpse the intentions of Japan, to see the shadows of fleets long before they emerged over the horizon, and to anticipate moves that the Japanese believed were invisible. These secrets, pulled from intercepted messages, reshaped the war. The Japanese military relied on radio communications more than they realized. Their empire stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific. Orders had to travel from Tokyo to fleet headquarters, from fleet commanders to ships scattered across vast oceans. In practice, this meant an almost constant stream of encrypted traffic. Every day, Japanese operators tapped out sequences of digits, relaying everything from logistics to strategy. To them, the codes were iron walls. To the Americans, who had been patiently reconstructing JN-25 for months, those walls were starting to crack. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor became the nerve center for this effort. Joseph Rochefort and his team noticed patterns not only in the numbers themselves, but in the rhythm of communication. A sudden surge of traffic between Tokyo and certain island garrisons often signaled preparations for new operations. Messages routed to forward bases hinted at supply shipments, reinforcements, or construction of airfields. Even when the content of the codes remained opaque, the patterns told their own story. It was a form of intelligence later called traffic analysis, and it allowed Hypo to predict movements even before the underlying codebooks were solved. The Japanese themselves unwittingly aided the Americans. Naval officers were trained to use precise formal phrasing, which meant certain expressions appeared repeatedly. Codebreakers could predict with high confidence that certain 5-digit groups corresponded to phrases like, "in accordance with," or "I respectfully report." These anchor points allowed them to strip away additives and begin rebuilding the codebook. Over time, words like aircraft carrier, midway, fuel, and reinforcements became identifiable. With each discovery, the veil over Japanese intentions grew thinner. In early 1942, one of the first major revelations came when the Americans intercepted messages concerning operations in the Coral Sea. By piecing together fragments of JN-25, Rochefort's team deduced that Japanese forces were preparing to move against Port Moresby in New Guinea. This insight gave Admiral Chester Nimitz the confidence to dispatch carriers to intercept them. The result was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. Though tactically inconclusive, it was strategically significant. Japan abandoned its attempt to cut off Australia. The Americans knew this opportunity only because analysts thousands of miles away had sifted through columns of numbers and realized what they meant. For the Japanese, the failure was inexplicable. Their commanders assumed they had acted in secrecy, never suspecting that the enemy had read their intentions in advance. Yet the most dramatic example came only weeks later. By May, JN-25 intercepts were buzzing with references to a target designated AF. The Japanese were planning a major operation, but the Americans did not know where. Rochefort suspected it was Midway, a small atoll whose airfield was critical to protecting Hawaii. To confirm his theory, he devised a clever ruse. Midway was ordered to send an unencrypted radio message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese code messages reported that AF is short of water. The deception worked, and Nimitz had proof. Midway was the target. This single revelation allowed the U.S. Navy to position its carriers in ambush, leading to the decisive victory at the Battle of Midway. Japan lost 4 of its fleet carriers, crippling its offensive power. The battle was won on the water, but it was prepared in the shadows, in the hidden world of code breaking. What made these breakthroughs possible was not just brilliance, but also the mistakes of the enemy. Japanese operators often reused additives or failed to change them regularly, creating exploitable patterns. Some messages were sent in both plain language and code, a fatal error that gave the Americans direct comparisons. Others included weather reports, which contained predictable language. Each slip became a stepping stone for the analysts. Overconfidence played a role as well. Japanese commanders had been assured that their codes were secure, and they never imagined the Americans had the resources or patience to rebuild them repeatedly. This complacency blinded them to the reality that every transmission was a potential leak. For the Americans, the decrypted messages provided more than tactical advantage. They offered insight into the psychology of the enemy. Analysts could read the tone of Tokyo's instructions, the anxieties of fleet commanders, and the urgency with which resources were shifted from one theater to another. They saw, for example, how Japan scrambled to reinforce the Solomon Islands after Guadalcanal turned into a costly struggle. They observed logistical strains as fuel shortages began to pinch. They even caught glimpses of political maneuvering between the Army and Navy, rival branches that often pursued conflicting agendas. Every intercepted message was a fragment of Japan's inner voice, exposed to its adversary. The intelligence was so sensitive that commanders had to disguise how they acted upon it. When submarines were vectored to intercept convoys, it was explained as scouting reports. When aircraft ambushed Japanese task forces, it was justified as lucky reconnaissance. To admit the truth risked alerting Tokyo that its codes were compromised. This need for secrecy sometimes created tension between field commanders and intelligence officers. Admirals wanted proof for their decisions, but analysts could provide only carefully worded summaries. Too much detail would risk exposure. Too little would undermine trust. It was a delicate balance maintained through discipline and faith in the unseen war. Errors by the Japanese continued to give the Americans opportunities. During 1942 and 1943, analysts noticed that certain phrases always preceded references to geographic areas. By correlating these with known movements, they reconstructed large sections of the codebook. Captured documents helped as well. When Allied forces raided enemy outposts, even scraps of burned codebooks or signal pads were treasures. Each piece accelerated the process of rebuilding JN-25 after updates. The Japanese believed changing their codes would permanently blind the Americans. In reality, each change slowed progress temporarily, but never erased it entirely. The Americans had built an assembly line of analysis, a process that could recover from disruption with increasing speed. The importance of this hidden knowledge cannot be overstated. In a theater where distances spanned thousands of miles, knowing the enemy's intention even a few days in advance was priceless. A carrier could be positioned in the right waters, a garrison could be reinforced before the attack, a convoy could be rerouted to avoid submarines. Again and again, American commanders acted not in reaction, but in anticipation. The Japanese never understood why their blows failed to land as expected. They attributed setbacks to chance, to the cunning of enemy admirals, or to bad weather. The truth was far simpler and far more devastating. Their own words had betrayed them. The revelation of Japanese moves extended beyond the major battles. Intercepts revealed details of supply shortages, allowing American submarines to target tankers carrying vital fuel from the Dutch East Indies. They exposed reinforcement schedules, leading to ambushes that bled Japanese troops before they could even reach the front. They revealed the transfer of air units, enabling American planners to anticipate new threats. Each fragment of intelligence multiplied in value when combined with others, forming a mosaic of Japanese strategy. By 1943, American codebreakers could often predict not just the next battle, but the overall direction of Japan's war effort. The cost of this hidden war was measured not in blood, but in exhaustion. Analysts endured endless hours in sweltering rooms, hunched over charts, their eyes blurred from staring at columns of digits. They lived with the constant fear that one careless slip could expose their advantage. When Japanese codes changed, it felt like disaster, a mountain of work collapsing in an instant. Yet each time, the teams rebuilt, faster and stronger, fueled by the knowledge that their work saved lives at sea and ashore. For many, the greatest frustration was silence. They could never share their achievements, never explain to friends or family why their work mattered. Only after the war would the world learn of the battles fought and won in the shadows. In the end, the Japanese secrets were undone not by weakness in their machines, but by the persistence of their enemy and the inevitability of human error. The Americans learned to think like their opponents, to anticipate their habits, and to exploit the smallest cracks in their armor. Every time Tokyo believed it was operating in silence, the reality was different. Their moves were already known, their strategies anticipated, their plans countered. It was a war of shadows, where knowledge replaced firepower and foresight replaced guesswork. The victories at Coral Sea, Midway, and beyond were shaped long before the fleets clashed in the patient, invisible work of those who listened to the enemy's whispers and turned them into warnings. By the summer of 1942, the Codebreakers' War had moved beyond reconstruction and guesswork. It had become a weapon as sharp as any torpedo, as decisive as any carrier strike group. The hidden struggle inside dim offices and makeshift huts now directly shaped the outcome of battles that determined the future of the Pacific. This was the stage when decrypted secrets were transformed into victories, when lines of numbers became the destruction of ships, and when the unseen hands of crypt analysts guided fleets across oceans to meet the enemy in decisive engagements. The Japanese still believed their communications secure. They still trusted their codes. But by then, the Americans were not only reading their messages, they were using them to set traps that would cripple Japan's ability to wage war. The most famous of these moments came at Midway in June 1942. From weeks of intercepts, Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had pieced together the outline of a massive operation. The Japanese planned to seize the atoll of Midway and lure the remaining American carriers into battle. They believed surprise was on their side, but Hypo's deception with the water report confirmed the target. Nimitz acted with confidence, deploying his carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. When the Japanese fleet advanced, expecting an easy victory, they instead sailed into an ambush. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed in the span of hours. The triumph at Midway was celebrated in headlines as a victory of courage and air power, but behind the scenes, it was a victory of information. Without decrypted messages, the U.S. Navy would never have been waiting in the right waters. The battle turned the tide of the Pacific, and it was won before the first bomb left a dive bomber's wings. But Midway was not the end of the Codebreakers' influence. It was only the beginning. As the war continued, intercepts revealed the movements of convoys, the redeployment of air units, and the desperate logistical measures Japan used to sustain its far-flung empire. American submarines became the deadly beneficiaries of this knowledge. Guided by intelligence from broken codes, they prowled shipping lanes with uncanny accuracy. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, freighters transporting troops to island garrisons, and supply ships bound for Guadalcanal all fell victim. Each sinking, starved Japanese forces drained their fuel reserves and tightened the noose around their empire. The submarines fired the torpedoes, but it was the analysts who aimed them. One of the most striking episodes came in April 1943 with Operation Vengeance. Intercepts revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, planned an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The decrypted schedule provided his exact route and timing. American commanders seized the opportunity. On April 18th, P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville and shot it down, killing him instantly. For Japan, the loss was a devastating blow to morale. For the Americans, it was proof that code-breaking could strike at the very heart of enemy leadership. The success remained secret for years, explained publicly as chance reconnaissance, but insiders knew the truth. It was the product of patient, relentless work by the codebreakers. As Allied forces advanced, the role of decrypts expanded. In the Solomon Islands, intelligence revealed when Japanese destroyers attempted high-speed supply runs, nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Armed with this knowledge, American forces ambushed them repeatedly, whittling down Japan's destroyer fleet. During the long struggle for Guadalcanal, codebreakers provided early warning of reinforcements, allowing U.S. Marines to brace for assaults and Navy ships to intercept transports. At every stage, the Japanese found themselves reacting to an enemy who seemed uncannily prepared, never suspecting that their own radio operators had provided the enemy with the script. The impact stretched beyond tactics. Decrypts revealed Japan's growing resource crisis. Analysts saw shipments of fuel decreasing, reports of shortages multiplying, and the frantic attempts to ration supplies. By 1944, Japanese carriers sailed with reduced air groups because there was not enough fuel for full training. Submarines sat idle in harbors. Entire operations were canceled because the oil would not last. American commanders knew all this from the intercepted messages. They could plan campaigns with confidence, knowing that the enemy was weaker than appearances suggested. This was intelligence on a grand scale, not just predicting a single battle, but charting the decline of an empire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, again bore the fingerprints of code-breaking. U.S. forces anticipated the Japanese counterattack against the invasion of Saipan. They positioned carriers and submarines to intercept, guided by intercepts that revealed timing and routes. When Japanese aircraft attacked, they were met by prepared American defenses and overwhelming fighter coverage. Hundreds of planes were destroyed, crippling Japanese naval aviation for good. The battle was remembered for the skill of American pilots, but the stage had been set in the shadows, where decrypted orders warned of the assault before it began. Perhaps no campaign illustrates the fusion of intelligence and victory better than the submarine war against Japanese shipping. By 1945, Japan was an empire strangled by hunger and thirst, not only from bombing, but from the quiet, relentless sinking of its merchant fleet. Submarines, aided by decrypted convoy routes, achieved devastating efficiency. They knew when tankers left port, what escorts they carried, and when they were expected to arrive. It was information warfare at its purest, the transformation of intercepted signals into sinking tonnage. By war's end, Japan had lost over 80% of its merchant fleet. Factories lacked raw materials, soldiers starved on isolated islands, and behind each sinking lay the patient work of men and women in places like Hypo, OP-20G, and the naval communication stations spread across the Pacific. The Japanese never fully realized the extent of their compromise. Even after repeated defeats, they clung to the belief that their codes were secure. They attributed Allied successes to luck, superior reconnaissance, or sheer coincidence. In truth, their reliance on radio, their predictable phrasing, and their faith in secrecy had betrayed them. The Americans never flaunted their advantage. To do so would have risked everything. Instead, they acted in silence, letting victories speak while analysts returned to their charts and machines, always searching for the next clue, the next fragment, the next chance to strike unseen. The hidden war was exhausting. Analysts lived in cycles of triumph and despair. Each time the Japanese introduced a new codebook, progress collapsed and the work began again. Days of staring at meaningless numbers stretched into weeks. Yet they persevered, driven by the knowledge that lives depended on their success. For them, the victories of Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons, the Marianas, Lady Gulf, all bore the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing they had played a role, even if no one outside their rooms would ever know. For decades, their contribution remained classified, their names absent from histories. Only later did the world learn that the Pacific was won as much in the code rooms as in the skies or on the seas. By 1945, the transformation was complete. Japanese naval power was shattered, their merchant shipping was annihilated. Their communications, once considered secure, were weapons in their enemies' hands. The codebreakers had turned secrecy into betrayal and information into victory. It was one of the great ironies of the war. Japan's reliance on radio had been its strength, but when those messages were no longer secret, they became a map that guided the enemy to every weak point. The Americans had mastered not just the art of battle, but the art of anticipation. In modern terms, it was information dominance, decades before the phrase was coined. The unseen war had shaped the visible one, and its results were decisive. When we look back on the Pacific War, it is easy to focus on the carriers, the island landings, and the vast naval battles. But behind each of those was an invisible foundation. Without code breaking, Midway might have been a disaster. Without decrypts, Yamamoto might have lived to direct further campaigns. Without intercepted convoy routes, Japan's merchant fleet might have endured longer. The story of the Pacific is the story of sailors and Marines. But it is also the story of analysts who fought with pencils, machines, and unrelenting determination. Their battlefield was the desk. Their weapons were logic and patience, and their victories were written not in headlines, but in the silent success of being one step ahead. And so the secret that won the Pacific was not just courage or firepower. It was knowledge. It was the ability to see the enemy's moves before they happened, to turn secrets into strategies, and to transform the hidden into the decisive. It was the Codebreakers' War, fought without glory, but with results that shaped history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into history's hidden battles. Give this video a like, it really helps get the word out to more people who love real stories of World War II. And now, here's a question for you. If the Japanese had realized their codes were broken and completely changed their communication system, do you think the Pacific War would have lasted longer? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.